Let me describe a couple to you. As you listen, see if this sounds familiar. They're both educated professionals. She works in marketing, earning about $62,000 a year. He works in IT, bringing in around $71,000. Together, their household income is $133,000 a year. On paper, that places them in the top quarter of American households. By every traditional standard, they should be doing well. They should be building wealth, maxing out retirement accounts, taking vacations without anxiety, feeling financially secure. But that's not their reality. Instead, they're stressed, they're tired, they're living paycheck to paycheck, or close enough that it feels the same. Their savings would maybe cover 2 months of expenses, and that's being generous. When their car needed an unexpected repair last month, they didn't pay for it in cash. They put it on a credit card. Both of them work full-time, often more than full-time. By the time they get home in the evening, they're exhausted. They rarely see each other during the week. Just a few drained hours at night before sleep takes over. And here's the part that really matters. They did everything right. They got the degrees, they built careers, they got married, they combined their finances, they bought a house in a decent school district. They followed the plan exactly as it was laid out for them. So why does it feel like they're drowning? Why does a household earning well into 6 figures feel so financially fragile? Why does it seem like one small disruption could knock everything off balance? If you've ever looked at your combined income and thought, we make too much money to feel this broke, you're not alone. And more importantly, this isn't a personal failure. It's the opening sign of something much bigger. For decades, we've been told a simple story. 2 incomes are better than 1. It sounds obvious, almost mathematical. If one person earning $50,000 can support a family, then 2 people earning $50,000 each should be able to do the same, with an extra $50,000 left over. More savings, more security, more freedom. That story feels so logical that we rarely question it. But here's the uncomfortable truth. That's not what happened. What actually unfolded was one of the largest financial bait and switches in modern American history. And most people never realized they were part of it. There's a name for this phenomenon. It's called the 2-income trap. The term was coined in 2003 by Elizabeth Warren, long before she entered politics, when she was a Harvard bankruptcy law professor. Together with her daughter, Amelia Warren Tyagi, she studied more than 2,000 American families who had filed for bankruptcy. What they discovered shocked almost everyone who read the research. 2 incomes did not make families safer, they made them more vulnerable. Households with 2 working parents were more likely to go bankrupt than households with a single income. Let that sink in. Working twice as hard, bringing home 2 paychecks, doing exactly what the modern economy encourages, and still being more likely to lose everything. This wasn't because these families were reckless. It wasn't because they lacked discipline or financial literacy. It was because they were trapped inside a system that quietly removed their margin for error. To understand how this happened, we have to step backward in time. Because the roots of the 2-income trap weren't created overnight. They were built slowly, over decades, and they only make sense when you look at what life used to look like before 2 incomes became the norm. To understand why 2 incomes became a trap, we have to go back to a time before they were the default. Let's rewind to the year 1970. At that time, less than half of women participated in the workforce. Most middle-class households followed a familiar structure: 1 primary earner, usually the father, and 1 parent at home, usually the mother. And here's the part that's hard to imagine today. That single income was enough, not barely enough, not constantly on the edge, actually enough. A typical middle-class family could afford a median-priced home while spending roughly a quarter of their income on housing. They could send their children to public schools that were reasonably funded, regardless of the exact neighborhood they lived in. They could pay for food, healthcare, transportation, and still have money left over. Money for savings, money for emergencies, money for the occasional family vacation. They had financial breathing room. But more importantly, they had something far more valuable than money. They had a backup plan. If the primary earner lost their job, got sick, or needed time away from work, the stay-at-home parent could enter the workforce. That second income wasn't being used. It was being preserved. It functioned like an insurance policy, a reserve engine that only needed to be activated when something went wrong. Now, fast forward to today. Female workforce participation is dramatically higher, especially among married mothers. In most households with children, both parents work. What was once an emergency option has become the default operating mode. The backup plan is no longer waiting in reserve. It's already being used just to pay the bills. And while household incomes are higher than they were decades ago, the cost of simply being middle class has exploded. Housing prices have doubled relative to inflation. Healthcare costs have risen several times over. Childcare, once unnecessary in many households, now rivals the cost of college tuition in some cities. Education, housing, healthcare, and childcare, the fixed costs of modern life, expanded to absorb every dollar the second income provided. So instead of two incomes creating stability, they became the minimum requirement just to stay afloat. The modern two-income family isn't more secure than the one-income family of the past. It's more exposed. Because the safety net that once existed has already been spent. At this point, some people push back. They say, "This doesn't apply to us. We're careful with money. We didn't let lifestyle inflation take over. We're the exception." Maybe you are. But before you decide that, let's walk through what actually happens to a second income in the real world. Not in theory, not in spreadsheets, but in day-to-day life. Imagine one partner earns $70,000 a year, the other earns $50,000. Combined, that's $120,000. It feels like a lot. So let's focus only on the second income, that $50,000. First, taxes. Because of progressive tax brackets, the second income doesn't get taxed the same way the first one does. It's stacked on top. Federal income tax, state income tax, payroll taxes. Depending on where you live, that $50,000 may lose 30 to 35% immediately. So before anything else happens, that income drops to roughly $32,000 to $35,000 in take-home pay. Now add childcare. If you have children, this isn't optional. The average cost of daycare in the United States is around $15,000 per child per year. In many cities, it's much higher. With just one child, that second income is already cut in half. With two children, it can disappear entirely. And we're not done. Two working parents means two commutes, fuel, maintenance, vehicle depreciation, parking. If a second car is required, add insurance, registration, and payments. Conservatively, commuting costs for the second worker can reach $8,000 a year. At this point, the $50,000 income is no longer $50,000. It's barely hanging on. But there's one more category most budgets never calculate directly: exhaustion. Two full-time jobs leave little energy for cooking, cleaning, repairs, or planning. So families compensate. They order more takeout. They buy prepared meals. They hire cleaners. They outsource tasks that once required time instead of money. These exhaustion expenses quietly add up. $5,000 a year, sometimes 10. When you total everything, taxes, childcare, commuting, convenience spending, the net contribution of that second income can fall to just a few $1,000s, sometimes less, sometimes negative. In real terms, someone may be working full-time, missing family dinners, sitting in traffic, living in constant fatigue, to add the equivalent of $1 or $2 an hour to the household. And yet, on paper, the household looks prosperous. That illusion is where the trap tightens. Here's where the two-income trap becomes truly dangerous. Not because of the math alone, but because of how it changes the decisions people make. When a household earns $120,000 or $130,000, that number starts to feel real. It shows up on tax returns. It shows up in bank conversations. It shows up when lenders evaluate what you can afford. So families begin to plan their lives around that combined income. They buy a house based on what two incomes qualify for. They finance cars that require two paychecks to maintain. They enroll their children in activities, schools, and routines sized for a dual-income lifestyle. The bank looks at their numbers and says, yes, you can afford this mortgage. And technically, that's true. As long as both incomes keep coming in, every month, every year, without interruption. That's the unspoken condition. No layoffs, no illness, no burnout, no aging parents who need care, no child with special needs, no life event that requires one person to step back. In other words, as long as life never happens. This is the moment the trap snaps shut, because the two-income household has already used its backup plan. Both incomes are fully committed to fixed expenses. There is no reserve capacity left. If one income disappears, the family doesn't just lose money. They lose the ability to meet obligations that were designed for two paychecks. The single-income family of the past could adjust. The stay-at-home parent could step into the workforce. The modern dual-income family has no equivalent move left. They're operating at 100% capacity. Everything works until it doesn't, and when it doesn't, the collapse is fast. That's why research consistently finds that dual-income families are more likely to experience financial crisis, not because they're irresponsible, but because they have no margin for error. To really understand why two incomes stopped being an advantage, we have to look at what happened to prices, especially housing. In the single-income era, families competed for homes based on one salary. That set a natural ceiling on how much people could pay. But when two-income households became common, that ceiling disappeared. Suddenly, families had twice the purchasing power. Not because homes became better, but because buyers had more income to throw into the same limited supply. So what do you think happened? Prices were bid up, not a little, a lot. Two incomes didn't create better housing. They created more aggressive competition for the same houses. What once required one income now required two. And once everyone needed two incomes to compete, two incomes stopped being a benefit. They became the price of entry. The same dynamic played out with education. Public schools in the United States are largely funded by property taxes. That means better-funded schools tend to exist in more expensive neighborhoods. Parents want good schools for their children. That's not greed, that's instinct. So families use their two incomes to outbid others for homes in good school districts. This turned education into a housing auction. You weren't paying tuition directly, but you were paying the equivalent of tuition through your mortgage. The cost of access to opportunity didn't disappear. It was embedded into housing prices. And once a family locked itself into that mortgage, there was no going back. Downsizing meant worse schools. Moving meant uprooting children. Returning to one income became impossible without massive sacrifice. The system quietly forced families into permanent dual-income dependence, not because they wanted luxury, but because they wanted stability. Ironically, the very thing meant to provide security ended up removing it. No one won the bidding war. Prices rose, stress increased, flexibility vanished, and two incomes became the new normal, not as a path to freedom, but as a requirement just to stand still. At this point, the question becomes unavoidable. What am I supposed to do? Most families can't simply drop an income. They need both paychecks to survive the life they've built. And that's the trap. You need two incomes because your expenses were designed for two incomes. So the solution isn't quitting a job overnight, it's changing how you think about income. Most households treat both incomes as permanent and guaranteed. They assume today's situation will continue indefinitely, so they build fixed costs around that assumption. The house, the cars, the routines, the obligations. Everything depends on both incomes continuing without interruption. The alternative is what we can call a one-income foundation. This means structuring your non-negotiable expenses so they can be covered by one income alone. The second income still exists, but it's no longer required for survival. It becomes optional, discretionary, a tool rather than a lifeline. Under this model, the second income goes toward building an emergency fund, paying down debt, investing for the future, creating options. Instead of inflating lifestyle, it builds resilience. This approach requires sacrifice. It means buying less house than you qualify for. Driving past neighborhoods you could technically afford, explaining why you didn't upgrade even after a raise. It can feel uncomfortable in the short term, but what it buys you is rare in the modern economy. Choice, the ability to step back if needed, the ability to absorb a shock without collapse, the ability to decide based on values, not fear. That's something two incomes were supposed to provide, but often failed to deliver. The two-income trap was never really about money. It was about flexibility. It was about margin. It was about having options when life doesn't go according to plan. Previous generations, with less income on paper, often had something modern families lack: the ability to absorb a shock. One person could lose a job. One parent could step away to care for children or family. One income could pause without the entire structure collapsing. That flexibility acted like a financial shock absorber. Over time, we traded it away. We traded margin for bigger houses, for nicer cars, for the appearance of prosperity. But appearances aren't wealth, cash flow isn't security, and high income doesn't mean resilience. Two incomes aren't better than one if both are already spent before they arrive. The families who thrive financially today aren't always the ones who earn the most. They're the ones who preserve their flexibility. They resisted the pressure to scale their lives to the maximum their income allowed. They kept their backup plan intact. They refused to build a life that collapses if one paycheck disappears. You can earn your way out of many problems, but you can't earn your way out of a trap you don't even know you're in. Now you do. The only question left is what you're going to do with that knowledge.